Let's jump right into this explainer because today we're looking at a totally fascinating, kind of wild intersection of pop culture and sociology. We're going to dive into how the ultimate underdogs, the classic picked-on nerds of 1980s high school comedies, actually grew up to become the absolute architects, and yeah, sometimes the bullies, of our modern digital world.
So, to map out this massive cultural role reversal, here is our agenda. We'll be covering Farewell to the Ogre, the 1980s nerd stereotype, the real nerd revenge, the rise of tech masculinity, the maladaptive nerd, and lastly, when nerds become ogres. Let's get into it.
Section 1. Farewell to the Ogre. We're actually kicking things off today by honoring the catalyst for this whole explainer, actor Donald Gibb, who sadly passed away recently at the age of 71. Now, if you grew up in the 80s, there is no way you don't recognize him. You almost certainly know him as Ogre, right? The absolute terrorizing frat house heavy from the 1984 classic film, Revenge of the Nerds. But here's what's so interesting. In reality, Gibb was a remarkably warm guy. He fully embraced his fictional persona as this massive brute, but he always made sure to put heart into the character. Off camera, his coworkers noted he was literally the complete opposite of the bullies he played.
And his actual life path? It perfectly encapsulates the traditional masculine ideal of that era. I mean, the guy went from being a college basketball and football star on scholarship to briefly playing in the NFL for the San Diego Chargers. After a car accident actually cut his athletic career short, he pivoted over to the silver screen. He had the massive build, he had the athletic background, and Hollywood basically used all of that to perfectly cast him as the quintessential 1980s jock.
All right, Section 2, the 1980s nerd stereotype.
So, Donald Gibb's career basically defined an entire generation's view of what social power looked like. Back then, there was this incredibly stark contrast. On one side, you had the jock, physically imposing, socially dominant, your classic bully. On the other side, you had the nerd. And mainstream America saw the nerd as physically weak, socially awkward, basically the mocked outcast, relegated to the absolute bottom of the social ladder. Well, at least before the tech boom hit.
So how exactly did this pop culture trope morph into our modern reality? To understand that, we're turning to a genuinely fascinating 2023 PhD dissertation by Benjamin Latini over at UMass Amherst. This research is incredible. It analyzes the socio-cultural evolution of nerd masculinity, taking a really deep dive into how these exact stereotypes shifted over the decades, right alongside the rapid rise of digital technology.
And this brings us to a really absolutely crucial concept for Explainer today, hegemonic masculinity. Now, basically, the idea here is that cultural power isn't just about physical force. It's not just a jock shoving someone into a locker. It's about who actually gets to set the accepted standards of success, influence, and dominance in a society. Latini's research explores how nerds went from being totally excluded from this hegemonic ideal to basically finding a backdoor right into it.
Moving on to Section 3, the real nerd revenge. Okay, get this. It is a little-known fact that the phrase, Revenge of the Nerds, was not actually invented by the 1984 movie that Donald Gibb starred in. No, it was coined 2 years earlier in a 1982 profile by journalist Paul Ciotti about Apple founders Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Think about that for a second. The media was basically framing a handful of white men hoarding unprecedented technological wealth as this quirky, comedic underdog story. It was a really clever way to mask a massive consolidation of power as just a harmless human interest narrative. Now, Latini's dissertation cleanly breaks down 4 distinct evolutionary stages of how nerds seized this power and adapted to digital hegemony. It's a progression. We start with the computer nerd, then evolve into the gamer, shift into the gatekeeper nerd, and finally confront what he calls the maladaptive nerd. Section 4. Rise of tech masculinity.
So how exactly did society transition from actively fearing computers to basically worshiping the men who controlled them? Well, as America somewhat reluctantly entered the digital age during the 1980s, this wave of computer phobia swept the workforce. People were terrified of these machines. And suddenly, the once mocked computer nerd held the literal keys to economic survival.
Figures like Bill Gates were completely mythologized. Society basically granted them what sociologists call a patriarchal dividend, meaning the privileges of dominant masculinity, simply because they were the ones who understood the machines. But, the computer nerd was still seen as a bit awkward. They were begrudgingly accepted for their wealth, but not exactly cool. But by the time video games went public, a new archetype emerged: the gamer. This is key, because the gamer identity offered a way for nerds to actively simulate traditional masculine competitiveness. Through gaming, they could be aggressive, they could be clever, they could be victorious. All those qualities that were traditionally reserved for the physical jocks. It made them feel so much closer to that normative cool guy ideal they had always been excluded from.
Section 5. The maladaptive nerd.
But here is the big question. What happens when historically marginalized outcasts suddenly gain power and desperately want to protect their new turf? As the internet expanded, those early gatekeeper nerds didn't exactly create a welcoming digital utopia. Instead, they used the anonymity of early forums to exercise intense, aggressive gatekeeping. They essentially recreated the exact same high school hierarchies that used to oppress them, only this time around, they were the ones on top. And Latini's research meticulously tracks how this gatekeeping seriously escalated once the internet became mainstream. The dissertation details how this defensive posturing morphed into the maladaptive nerd. It traces a direct, sobering line from early forum gatekeeping against women and people of color, right up to global harassment campaigns like Gamergate, tragic instances of maladaptive misogyny like the Elliot Rodger violence, and the entry of white male backlash politics into the digital mainstream. The very space they built to escape bullying had somehow incubated entirely new digital forms of it. Which brings us to Section 6, when nerds become ogres. Latini's research points out something truly fascinating about this massive cultural shift. Even at the absolute heights of global power, the underlying psychology often just remains. The dissertation notes that figures like Elon Musk, despite their immense, unimaginable wealth and influence, often still display a deep-seated insecurity. You see it when they perform public victimhood or engage in online backlash politics. According to the research, it's because the insecurity that was implanted in the nerd identity right from its inception, well, it never really goes away. A nerd in power is still a nerd, as they say.
The whole Revenge of the Nerds narrative was initially sold to us as this inspiring, feel-good meritocracy. We all cheered for the underdog, right? But as the research clearly illustrates, the modern reality is way more complex. These outcasts didn't dismantle the oppressive social hierarchy. Actually, scratch that. In many online spaces, they kept the old hierarchy completely intact. They just unseated the jocks and installed themselves as the wealthy gatekeepers and toxic enforcers at the very top.
So, why does all of this matter? It matters because it forces us to really reflect on the stories we tell ourselves about power. Donald Gibb played the physical ogre with a surprising amount of genuine heart. Meanwhile, the real-world nerds we once celebrated as these harmless underdogs often ended up mimicking the very brute behavior they used to fear. What you should really take away from this explainer is a critical question. As the outcasts gained ultimate digital dominance, did they actually reshape the world for the better, or did they simply become the new ogres of the modern age? It's definitely something to think about the next time you log on.